Hi guys, my name is Skylar, and in my workshop style panel, I will be talking about how to construct stylized characters, like how to construct faces and anatomy from multiple different angles, stylized facial features, and more. So, a little bit more about me. I'm Skylar. I use they or any pronouns. I specialize in character, environment, and concept art, and you can find me in the Artist Alley under the name Skylar Song. And if you want to learn more about me or see more of my art or commission me, feel free to check out my website. Here, I will leave my socials again at the end of this panel. Okay, let's get started. What is construction and why is it important? Construction is basically the framework onto which you build your character. It's a system, a series of simplified shapes, guidelines, and proportions, which becomes the foundations of your character. Have you ever drawn something, but it just feels off, yet you can never quite put your finger on what exactly feels off? Chances are something went wrong in the construction stage. Having a system of construction also gives you the flexibility to draw bodies and faces from many different angles. All right, this is the list of things I will talk about today in this panel. Number one, shape language and character design, and then I will move on to talk about the basic proportions and constructions of the faces, and then the basic proportion and construction of anatomy, as well as how to draw using references, and also more examples and demonstrations. Okay, shape language. Shape language is a very important concept in character design. Um, the idea of shape language is that the human brain associates shapes with different qualities. Shapes can tell a story, show personality, and elicit different emotional responses. Like the examples you see here with these three different shapes. For example, round and smoother shapes are great to portray warm and friendly characters, whereas angular and sharper shapes can convey menace or um, be used more on antagonists. Of course, this is not a hard and fast rule and can be subverted, but it's something you should keep in mind while designing your characters. What emotions or characteristics do you want to convey, and how does shape contribute to that? Here are some other things you should keep in mind in addition to shape language. This is things like facial expression, narrative, and style. For example, in terms of facial expression, there are so many different muscles on the human face, and the slightest shift in how you draw the eyes, for example, can dramatically shift the expression of a character. Secondly, narrative. What type of narrative are you trying to convey? And what elements are you going to utilize to convey this narrative? And then lastly, style. There are so many different styles of digital art, of character art. What style are you trying to do? And basically, what stylistic elements will you utilize and to link into that particular style? Before we continue, I just wanted to mention the fact that construction is a very subjective process, and that this is simply my personal way of constructing characters with techniques I learned both from my own experience as well as studying the construction process of other artists. What works for me may not work for a different artist. So basically, what I'm trying to say is you can take whatever from this workshop that you find is helpful to you personally. All right, let's actually start with facial construction. I'm going to first quickly go over the basic process guidelines and proportions before showing a real-time example and discuss facial features in more detail. What I usually do is I start off with a circle. I'm going to show two examples side by side, um, just for more reference. Once I have a circle, I usually draw a vertical line straight down the middle, and then a horizontal line straight down the middle, making a cross shape. And then I draw a horizontal line slightly above the halfway point of the middle line at the top of the circle. And I do the same thing for the bottom half. Okay, I usually, what happens is I take the distance of this chunk right here, extend it down, and that point is where I will place the chin. So basically, from this point to this point, the distance should be in even thirds. Okay, next, how I draw the chin is I usually draw two slanted lines that slant slightly inward to about the halfway point of this chunk right here. And then I simply connect the line, connect this point to the chin. And obviously this is where I would keep in mind shape language and think about the shape of the chin, the length of the chin, etc. And then what I usually do is I lighten the guidelines and I draw in the neck. Facial features, I will talk about them in more detail later. Okay, where I would place the nose is, you see the three lines I drew previously. I will usually place the nose right on the little dot right there. And the mouth, usually between the halfway point of this line and the chin is the bottom, where I would place the bottom of the lip. And eyebrows, the middle line right down the circle is usually where I would place the eyebrows proportion-wise. And of course, the eyes. I usually place the eyes slightly above the midpoint of the nose, between this line and this line. And then I add in the pupils and other details, and then after many hours of work, I would have a complete illustration based on this construction process. Okay, now let's talk about stylized facial features. What I think is the most fun part of constructing faces. Now, there are so many different ways to stylize facial features. Shape language and style is very important to keep in mind here. What are you trying to go for? Is like semi-realism or manga or another style? And do you want to utilize sharper shapes or smoother features? And what type of emotion or personality do you wish to convey? For example, if you're going for semi-realism, maybe this would be a nose shape you would use, or this would be a lip shape that you would use. If you're doing a more stylized characters, you may, do a more simplified nose or a simplified mouth where you imply the teeth instead of drawing out every tooth, etc. as an example. Okay, stylized eyes. In my opinion, eyes is the most important part of a character's face. Eyes can convey so much character, emotion, and personality, and is what I think really defines your character. Here, I kind of drew a few of my favorite stylized eye shapes that I like to use with names I kind of personally gave them. For example, like I call this the classic almond, I call this the three-pronged, the almond variant, the arrow, semi-realism shape, and the long pupil. And this is where shape language, this is a good demonstration of shape language. For example, you look at shapes like the classic almond or the long pupil, it's very smooth and very round. Whereas if you look at shapes like the arrow and the three-pronged, there are more sharp angles and more edged, sort of edge to it. So shapes like this one or this one are great for antagonists, villains, or characters with chiseled features, or kind of cold / refined characters. Whereas eye shapes like this one are great for like protagonists, characters that are warm or friendly or endearing. And another important thing to keep in mind in terms of eyes is the importance of pupil size. If you read enough manga or watch enough anime, you will know that teeny tiny pupil is something that can be used to convey a manic sort of expression or a scheming kind of expression. So when you draw your eyes, think about the pupil size and think about how changing the pupil size will affect the facial expression of the character. Now, let's move on to two video examples of facial construction. Please feel free to follow along in a sketchbook or in a digital program if you want. The construction process works pretty much the same digitally and traditionally. You can create a character of your own or draw an existing character that you love, kind of whatever floats your boat. I'm going to first do a frontal view example, then an example of the 3/4 view. Since I've already kind of went over the basic process, I'm just going to talk about some miscellaneous things and tips as I play these examples here. I know I've kind of already demonstrated two frontal view examples, but I still think it's helpful to kind of see the process in video form. Plus, the frontal view is kind of the most basic view before mastering how to draw a face facing the front. It's very difficult to move on to drawing faces from more complex angles. However, this basic construction process is applicable to all sorts of different angles once you kind of get it down. Another thing I should say is for the both examples I will be showing, I am drawing without a reference, which is not good practice. Don't follow my lead here. Most of the time when you are drawing a character, it's always a good idea to kind of look up references and go from there. Later on in the panel, I will discuss how to use reference photos to drill and practice construction. Once you are familiar with the construction process, however, you may become comfortable drawing without a reference, but it's still a good idea to look up a reference afterwards anyway, just to make sure you didn't make a glaring mistake that you couldn't see because you stared at the thing you've been drawing for way too long. You may also wonder if I'm drawing any character in particular here. No, I'm just kind of making some arbitrary decisions as I move along for the sake of demonstration. Along the way, you may see me take some digital shortcuts, but again, the process is pretty much the same. Traditionally, it just might take slightly longer. Now, if you are designing your own character, this is where you should again keep in mind narrative and shape language, especially when you draw in the facial features. One little trick when drawing faces that I find very helpful is to draw the nose first, because the nose is basically the center of the face. It's much harder to mess up the positions of the other features if you have your nose in the right position. One thing I didn't mention in the previous section is the ears. The ears, like the other facial features, can come in a variety of different shapes and can be stylized in many different ways. In terms of proportion, I typically place the top of the ear right above where the eyes are and the bottom of the ear right around where the nose ends. I personally prefer to just kind of keep the ears very simple with not that much detail compared to the other facial features. Some more tips regarding facial features. In my opinion, it's better to keep all of them somewhat stylistically consistent. For example, if you make your eyes semi-realistic, but all of your other facial features are ultra stylized, the eyes will for sure look kind of out of place. And on the topic of eyes, a struggle you may encounter when drawing eyes is how to make the pupils look decent. Personally, I would say the best way to make decent looking pupils in the shortest amount of time is to practice basic shading technique. Some quick, appropriate shading on the pupils immediately makes the eye pop. Adding a bit of highlight can also make the eye stand out. And as you can see from what I'm drawing here, it really doesn't take that long to fill in the pupil, and it makes a big difference. Okay, now I've went over a bunch of things. I'm just gonna quickly summarize this entire process once again. Number 1, I draw a circle. Number 2, draw guidelines within that circle. Number 3, I find the chin point based on the distance between the guidelines. And number 4, I draw in the chin. Number 5, I draw in the neck and lighten the guidelines. Number 6, I draw in the nose according to the lightened guidelines. And number 7, I draw in the eyebrows, eyes, and mouth. Which in my experience can pretty much go in any order once you kind of establish the position of the nose. The ears can also kind of go in any time of this process. Okay, now that we've talked about the basic process in detail, let's spice it up a bit and add angles to the mix. Moving on to drawing faces from different angles. Now, when something is not in the frontal view, you have to think three-dimensionally. Instead of thinking of a circle, you have to kind of think of it as a sphere which has volume. To draw faces from different angles effectively, it's usually really helpful to have a little bit of foundation in perspective and in rendering 3D geometric shapes. The guidelines will still be the same. You still have two lines going straight down the middle of the sphere, making a cross shape, except the lines will become curved due to perspective, and the center of the sphere will shift depending on the angle. The one difference is, besides having extra lines on the top and the bottom, between the middle line and the top of the sphere, like usual, I also have two lines on either side of the sphere, from kind of the very edge of the sphere and the middle of the sphere slightly displaced from the center. And again, this is where the 3D volume of the sphere really matters. You kind of have to curve those lines according to the form of the sphere, which is something that will become much easier if you practice rendering 3D shapes a lot. These guidelines will be very helpful for placing the chin. And after I have basic guidelines on the sphere, I usually do the same thing where I take the distance between the line at the center of the sphere and the line either at the bottom or the top of the sphere. In this case, the line at the bottom of the sphere, towards the bottom of the sphere, is not visible due to perspective and the angle at which the sphere is turned. I find the center point in which the two lines which goes down the middle crosses and extend it down the same distance, marking the point of the chin. And once again, from the point of the chin to the line at the very top, it should be divided into even thirds. And when drawing the chin from an angle, I usually start from the side of the sphere, like drawing a line on the side of the sphere, right from the middle of the oval that the guideline on the side makes. I slant that line slightly inwards and then connect it to the point of the chin. After this, I connect the chin to the middle of the sphere on the other side. And then I would have a simple chin that is drawn from an angle. Another important thing to keep in mind when drawing faces from an angle is that the facial features will obviously become distorted by perspective too. This may feel challenging to deal with, but that's where references come in handy. Knowing how to draw facial features from different angles is something that comes with practice and experience. This is something that I also struggle a lot with, but if you keep practicing, you will find that the process slowly becomes easier and faster. And I will just let this example here play for a few more seconds before I move on to talk about anatomy. Now, let's move on to constructing anatomy. In this section, I will be talking about the basic proportions and guidelines I usually use to construct bodies from different angles. But before we continue, a small disclaimer. The examples I will be showing is of a specific body type. Obviously, it's far from the only body type out there. And this is also by no means implying that any particular body type is quote unquote normal or standard or ideal. Due to the time constraint of this panel, this particular body type and proportion is simply what I will be using as an example. You can sort of easily alter the proportion, size, etc. of the basic guidelines and shapes I will be discussing to accommodate for any type of body shape of your choosing. So I am not as good at explaining things and describing them in words as I am demonstrating them visually, but I will still try my best to describe my process. But if at any point you feel kind of very confused about what I'm saying, feel free to just ignore it and look at the visuals instead. Okay, now let's move on to anatomy, the bane of every artist's existence. It's something that seems extremely intimidating. However, by breaking down the human body into simpler shapes, guidelines, and proportions, it's something that becomes manageable. Now, this 30-second time lapse that you just saw was done without any reference. And like I've mentioned before, it's always a good idea to use references, but I just kind of wanted to demonstrate that once you've developed a good system of construction and know the proportions, it's possible to kind of draw poses that you imagine just from your mind. Okay, now for a real-time example, and let me break down the process in more detail. First, I usually draw a placeholder face with a simple circle and chin. This is where the facial construction that I just talked about comes in handy. You just kind of draw a simplified version of a face that you would see. After I have that, I draw in the neck. And after I have the neck, what I usually do is I break down the human torso into two shapes, an ellipse and a distorted trapezoid. These are the shapes that I find the most intuitive to me, and as I've mentioned before, every artist has their own system of construction, and this is what I've simply found worked for me with techniques I've both developed myself and also learned from watching other artists and learning from them. So for the ellipse for me marks the top half of the torso, and the distorted trapezoid marks the bottom half of the torso. I usually draw the ellipse starting right from where the neck ends. I typically make the ellipse slightly longer than the length of the entire face. Now, you may underestimate the length of this face. So just by looking at it, I've done it many times and made the upper torso kind of slightly too small. So it's usually a good idea to kind of measure the face and make sure you're actually drawing the upper ellipse of the torso slightly larger than the face itself. After I kind of have the upper torso, I try to mark the midline of the torso. This line is very helpful to indicate the direction the body the torso is distorted and turned towards, but since I'm just demonstrating a frontal view example here, it matters less than if you're drawing it from an angle. Another thing in terms of proportion is that the upper torso and the lower torso is about the same length, aka the ellipse and the distorted trapezoid are the same length. I just take the distance of the ellipse, extend it down the same distance, and mark the end of the torso right there. After I have that, I take the halfway point of the ellipse and draw two lines from the midline, which kind of indicate the rib cage. when I draw the shoulders, I draw 2 small circles just above the ellipse, which indicates the upper torso, on either side of the torso, which marks the shoulder. And then starting from the very top of these circles, I draw 2 lines that start at the top of the circle and slant slightly downward, ending at around the middle of the torso, which marks the collarbones. And then I draw a small V shape, which kind of further defines the collarbone. And then I go to the top of this circles again, which indicates the shoulder. I draw 2 lines, which now slant slightly upward instead, ending right at around where the neck is. Okay, now let's move on to the lower torso. For the lower torso, which is a distorted trapezoid, I draw 2 lines which slant slightly outwards to the length where it meets the end of the torso. And then I kind of connect these 2 lines with a slightly curved line, marking the bottom of the torso. Now, I take about the halfway point of that distorted trapezoid and I connect it to the end of the midline of the torso, which kind of marks where the crotch area and where the leg begins. After this, I take the 2 lines I just drew and find the point which kind of marks your hip bone. From that point, I extend down 2 small lines, which ends at about the halfway point between the hip bone and the bottom of the torso. And from that point, I draw lines which indicate where the legs begin. Now, to keep the thing simple, we're going to say that the length of the leg is exactly the length of the upper body, aka the head, the neck, and the torso combined, for this particular body type at least. After I measure where the foot would land, sometimes in my mind, sometimes I would actually measure it, I usually mark where the knees will be, and then I draw in the thighs like so. The thigh shape can be a challenging thing, but it's actually pretty simple after you practice drawing thighs a little bit. The shape of the thigh is basically an organic cylinder. One mistake that I used to make is I would draw lines which are very straight and not kind of organic at all. Remember, for the thighs is thicker towards the top than at the bottom. Okay, then I usually would mark where the feet will land, and I draw in the lower leg. Now, a lot of people struggle with the shape of the lower leg, and I struggle with the shape of the lower leg a lot too. To this, kind of the only thing I can say is to just practice and look at a lot of reference pictures until you can picture the shape in your head as a 3D shape that occupies space instead of thinking in 2D. Here's the tip I can give. Think about the lines marking the outside of the lower leg as a distorted S shape. For a lot of different angles, not every angle, but for a lot of them, it starts thinner than the knees, becomes slightly wider, becomes thinner again, and then becomes slightly wider again at the ankles. With a lot of practice, you can become relatively comfortable with drawing it just from imagination. And then lastly, I would draw in the arms. Now, arms is something I struggle a lot with, and I'm still currently trying to get better at it and practice more, and especially without reference pictures. I'm very self-conscious about kind of how I draw the arms. First, I guess I usually mark where the hand is. As a general rule of thumb, the hand lands just somewhere below the torso when your arm is semi-relaxed. In terms of an arm shape, it's basically, I would say the same thing about as leg shape. It can feel very challenging to not have like noodle arms sometimes, but again, practice is everything. I personally still struggle a lot with arms if I draw without any reference pictures, a lot more so than I struggle with legs. You could see when I drew the legs, I kind of did it relatively quickly, But when I draw the arms, I do it, I undo it, and I do it again, and I still feel like something is wrong. And this is where reference pictures comes in handy, so you can know kind of exactly what you're not doing right. On this note, I guess I'll mention again that my process is by no means perfect at all. The entire construction process and your own construction system is always an ever evolving one. Every artist has their own system, which they develop over the years and they alter and change. Construction, it's something that can feel so tedious, yet it's something that is so important in character design. And with that said, I'm going to let the last few seconds of this clip finish playing here before I move on to talk about how to practice using references. Now let's move on to practicing and drilling with reference pictures. Here you can see a time-lapse video of me studying different poses from a anatomy reference sheet. One thing I would say is try not to trace, because tracing a picture doesn't necessarily teach you how to do something. You just kind of learn how to trace something. What I would usually do when I practice anatomy or faces, but here the example I showed is of anatomy, I find reference pictures that I wish to practice from. I put the reference picture on one side and then leave the canvas blank on the other side. I turn down the opacity of the reference picture slightly because I just personally find that it's easier on my eyes. Now, it's not a good idea to trace over the reference pictures, but something I do is I sometimes would draw one line over the reference picture that marks the middle of the torso. I find that it becomes a lot more helpful for me to visualize how to approach drawing something that way. Now you will see I still use the same construction process that I explained previously. I look at the reference picture and I try to break down the pose and the body into simple shapes, into the system of shapes that I've discussed. Now, one thing that's very important when you practice is to always use reference pictures. Drawing without a reference shouldn't be something that you do to practice. It's more something that maybe you want to test your skills or challenge yourself. But when you're practicing, you should always use reference pictures. And the reason why is I find when I draw without reference pictures, I am constantly questioning my own decisions. I always go, is this right? Am I doing it right? Did I get the perspective wrong and drew these muscles all wonky and stuff? And because I'm constantly questioning myself, it's not as productive an experience as drawing with reference. And drilling and practicing is always a tedious process, but it's something that is very necessary for you to be able to get better at it and for you to eventually be able to feel at least slightly comfortable drawing without a reference and know that you at least kind of got the basic proportions and things right. References are especially helpful for drawing things from different angles because angles are hard and the human body is very complex. Even when you do break down the human body into simplified shapes, when these shapes become distorted by different poses and different angles, it becomes difficult to draw from your imagination. For example, the ellipse that represents the upper torso that I always draw, with different angles, it becomes distorted in different ways. It becomes thinner or thicker. Same thing for the distorted trapezoid. It it shifts, it becomes different. The lower line of the torso becomes curved in different ways. The center of the torso lands in different places, and therefore it becomes hard to visualize. Drawing using references is really something that can help you practice visualizing things in 3 dimensions. It's something that will really help you practice thinking of these simplified 2D shapes not as 2 dimensions, but rather as a 3-dimensional volume that occupies space. And that can be something that's very challenging, especially if you don't already have a foundation in art or a foundation in rendering 3D geometric objects. And reference pictures really help with that. Now, like I said, tracing is not a great idea, but once you finish your figure drawing from your reference picture, you may find it helpful sometimes to overlay it on top of the reference image you drew from and see exactly where you kind of messed up big time, basically. There are many different times where I study anatomy or faces from a reference picture, and afterwards I overlay it on top of the reference picture and realize there are some very consistent and common mistakes that I make all throughout each example. And it's very important to identify those mistakes so that you can keep those in mind while you continue to practice. After the time lapse of the anatomy practice finishes playing, I will play another short 30-second time lapse video of a illustration I've made, just so you can kind of see the construction process in practice in an actual piece. With that said, I am going to stop talking now and just let the visuals play here for a minute or two while I put Isabella's lullaby in the background. Enjoy. And that would be it from me for now. I really appreciate you stopping by my workshop. Here are my links once again. Please check out my website, sunsky.com, if you wish to see more of my art, commission me, or just learn more about me. And once again, you can also find me in the Artist Alley of Anime Destiny under the name Skylar Song. And last but not least, I hope you learned something new today about shape language, style, and character construction, and hopefully learn some new techniques that will help you create your own original characters or draw characters from shows and movies that you love. Thank you for coming and have a great rest of the week.